All right, I'm Rachel Woody. I am here with Annedria Beckham, and we're at Union Wine Co. And we're here, is it Amphorae if it's plural?
Amphorae if they're plural. Yeah, amphora for a single.
Excellent. And so, Andrew, we definitely want to cover everything about the Amphorae. But my first question is why using the amphora?
Okay, so the inspiration for the project came from Elisabetta, and she's a producer in Italy who uses amphora in her cellar. And after my wife showed me some imagery with her vessels and her usage in her winemaking practice, I became really interested and intrigued. And so I began the project by building 31-liter vessels that were fired at a multitude of different cone values. And the idea there was that I would fill the vessels with a finished Riesling and weigh them weekly to see what the evaporation loss translated to in terms of volume at each cone value. And it was through that process I was able to hone in on the most appropriate firing temperature for these vessels to be viable to make wine in. Fired at too low of a temperature, the containers weep, they lose volume, and you wind up with sanitation problems. Fired at a temperature beyond the point of vitrification, and the vessels are sealed and non-porous, and they don't have any of the beautiful characteristics that we're looking for in a breathable terracotta body. So it was at the conclusion of that couple-month trial period that I made a really important discovery. I learned that without seasoning or treating the vessels with a very hefty tartaric acid solution, that the basic nature of the clay would remove all the acid from the wine. So we took a really beautiful Riesling that had a pH of 2.8 and we ruined it in the test vessels. We shifted the pH to almost 4 in just a couple months.
Wow.
So not only did that experiment lead me to the right firing temperature for viability, but it also helped me discover that the vessels needed to be treated and seasoned. So moving forward from that point, I started to build some containers that would work to make commercial wine in. And the first step was to try and get to about 60 gallons. So several of these are at the 60-gallon range. Like this one here and this guy here. And the problem with that volume is that it doesn't translate to anything after you press the wine off. So at a 60-gallon vessel, after it's pressed, is going to result in about 40 gallons of finished wine, and that is not a volume that's familiar or practical to work with in a commercial setting.
Right.
So the next step in the project was to scale the vessels to about 90 gallons so that we would have a pressed 60-gallon lot that would be familiar and translatable into other containers in the winery.
Is that a 90-gallon right there, that taller one?
This is about 200 gallons.
200 gallons,
yeah,
okay.
So this large vessel took a 1.25 tons of fruit to fill. The vessels that are at this height range here are about 90 gallons.
Okay.
In addition to exploring firing temperature, I've also been looking at shape and how shape relates to our intention with our winemaking. So the conical bottom forms, like this vessel here, we're referring to as amphora, but technically would not be an amphora because they're larger than 40 gallons and they don't have handles. But amphora is a term that people are familiar with. So these vessels with the conical bottom I'm using for skin contact white ferments. As the skins and seeds stratify to the bottom of the vessel, the seeds sit on the bottom, the skins on top. Our extractable surface area is much more limited than in a broad bottom tank. So for a skin contact white, we can stay on the skins and seeds for a much longer duration than we could in a broad bottom vessel. I've been exploring the Clevery form from the Republic of Georgia, which is the bulbous form here. And in Georgia, these vessels are subterranean. They're often lined in wax, but they're kept underground. And we've been using these vessels for red fermentations. And then I'm also exploring and experimenting with the egg form. And the egg has some really interesting kinetic qualities. We're using the egg form for pressed whites as it tends to stir the wine and keep the wine turbid without any intervention. We don't have to go in and stir the lees.
Right.
And the vessels have some really amazing qualities. They're incredibly porous, so the potential for gas exchange is quite large. When the vessels are in fermentation, we really don't see a lot of percolation through the bungs until we're at about 10 or 12 bricks, when the ferments are really ripping along. The gas is pushed through the wall until we're at that point where they're really chugging. So the potential then for oxygenation and gas exchange is much more so than in a barrel. Looking at dissolved oxygen rates, I found that the DO in the Amphorae is about twice what it is in wood. And the wines coming from these vessels tend to mature and age at a much faster rate than they're aging and maturing in wood. The containers, because of their negative charge, as clay is a negatively charged item, the negative charge in the clay body tends to act as a catalyst for protein stabilization. So we're bottling these wines without filtration and fining. The proteins are bound to the negative charge in the clay body, and we're then able to produce wines with incredible clarity without any intervention. Let's see, what else would be of note?
I'm curious about the logistics, going from, first of all, creating these things to what it takes to move them, fire them, get them here, fill them with grapes or wine. What are all the logistics you had to conceive of, because it's so much different from putting it in a steel tank or an oak barrel?
Okay, well, from a production standpoint, the logistics were quite complicated. With the equipment that is commercially available, I was only able to build these vessels at a maximum width of 28 inches and a maximum height of about 48. So I was at a stopping point with the scale of the vessels based on the equipment that I had. So with the help of a local kiln and wheel manufacturer, I was able to get some equipment that allowed me to scale much beyond the 90-gallon range into the 200-gallon range and beyond. Working with vessels that weigh 1,000 pounds in the studio has required some creative ingenuity. They're too cumbersome and heavy and hard to handle with human hands. So we've had to resort to using a forklift, and we've had to come up with means to move the vessels around and get them in and out of the kilns without lifting by hand. So transportation of the containers is kind of funny. These at 90 gallons sit in the front seat of my Volkswagen Jetta just perfectly, and I can transport them in my car. The larger vessels, like the 200-gallon vessel here, had to build a cradle and put that in the back of our farm truck to get it down here. My hope over the course of the next year is to scale to the 300 or 350-gallon range, getting closer to 2,000 pounds of clay. And they're probably going to be moved on some kind of a flatbed truck once we get to that scale. In the winery, the practicality of these vessels in terms of managing their fragility and also handling their mobility has been a challenge. So at the end of last year, I broke one of the vessels, and I was determined not to have that happen again. We're in a facility where we need to have mobility. The vessels need to be pushed around and moved during crush and during the aging process. So they're now all anchored on wooden pallets. I've had a fabricator build me stainless steel hoops or rings that capture the neck of the vessel. The hoop is then anchored to the pallet using a set of webbing straps. I've had a fabricator build me stainless steel lids that we seal to the top of the Amphorae with an aneological mastiche. And with this setup, the vessels are mobile, so I can move them under the distemmer for crushing. When we get ready to empty them, I can tip them with the forklift to empty their contents. And then when they're full of finished wine for the aging process, they're also mobile. So the logistics behind creating a vessel that would work in a commercial setting has been a challenge. Mm-hmm. They also take up a great deal of room in the winery. They have a big footprint. Mm-hmm. So I have 33 of them that I made wine in for the 2015 vintage, and we're hoping to double that to about 60 vessels for this coming vintage. And I got the year wrong. I've got about 30 of them that I've made for the 2014 vintage, hoping to have 60 for the 15 vintage. And we're going to put pallet racking in here, and they're going to go a couple vessels high. on the bases, they are stable, so they can be maneuvered, and theoretically they should be able to go up into the air to consume less floor space.
Wow. When you got started and you decided and committed to using the Amphora as your vessel, were there some real skeptics out there, or did you find that the wine community was like, yeah, all right, experimenting?
Well, certainly there was some enthusiasm regarding trying something new and pioneering a new way to make wine in Oregon. Mm-hmm. A lot of people that I shared the project with initially, when I told them that I was going to make Pinot Noir and Amphora, they said, why? So there was an interesting response there. But really, ultimately, the wine is going to speak for itself, and we are incredibly excited with the wines that have come from these vessels. There are some tendencies that the Amphora seem to impart. There's a common textural component to the wines coming from Amphora that we see regardless of varietal. The wines coming from clay tend to have a very dusty brick-like tannin structure, and we see that in Pinot Noir, we see it in Riesling, we see it in Malbec, we've seen it in Gruner. So in all the varietals that we've made in these vessels, there's a common textural component. The wines coming from clay tend to be very bright and high-toned. The fermentation curve with these vessels is quite interesting. They are very cool and mild. So with all of our lots that we've done in Amphora, we did sister or twin ferments and macro bins, and we noticed initially a huge difference in the extraction and the fermentation curve between the two vessels. The Amphora peak at between 22 and 23 degrees Celsius. The macro bins tend to peak closer to 30 degrees. The fermentation duration in the Amphora is between 21 and 25 days versus 10 or 11 days in a macro bin. So the resulting wines at the conclusion of primary are very different. The wines coming from clay are very bright, they're high-toned, they sing of fruit. And then as we have returned these wines and have aged in the vessels, we're seeing some really interesting characteristics to the wines being aged in these vessels as well. They're maturing at a faster rate. They also have the microoxygenation occurring. But more than anything, it's a true expression of the fruit. Mm-hmm. There's no oak that's getting in the way. Mm-hmm. We've pulled oak from the equation, but we're not lacking something. We've replaced it with something else intriguing and of great interest.
That's wonderful. So Elisabetta was the inspiration. She's also using these vessels. Have you had a chance to meet her or speak with her, or has there been an exchange of knowledge there?
Well, one of the challenges working with these Amphora in Oregon is that there's no one to ask about how they're performing. We were lucky enough to meet Elisabetta Foradori's daughter about 5 months ago at a dinner she was hosting at a local restaurant. And her daughter, Miarta, was really excited to meet us because her mother had heard about our project. And she's here doing an exchange at OSU. She's studying soils at Oregon State, and we spent several hours together talking about commonalities with our wines and wines that her mother has made in her cellar. So we were floored that her mother knew about our small project in Oregon, being that she's Italian, but we were incredibly enthusiastic about having a chance to share the wines with Miarta, and talk about what she's seen, and then come here and taste the wines together in our cellar. And the trip that we're making to France this summer, we may likely meet up with Elisabetta and Miarta for part of our trip.
Gosh, how wonderful.
Yeah.
We're going to Tuscany.
Tuscany?
Yeah.
Well, of course.
We were actually super shocked that she knew about us. Yeah.
And how affirming I'm sure it must be to know that the news reached her.
Yeah.
And that
Where does she get her vessels?
Where does Elisabetta get her vessels?
Her vessels are made in Spain. And she's relatively new to the concept of making wine in Amphora. She started in 2009. There are some producers that have been using these vessels for a much longer time than she has. Yeah.
Is it common more so in Europe to use these vessels for fermentation, or is it still pretty unique even over there?
It's still fairly unique. There's an 8,000 year unbroken chain of making wine in Amphora in the Republic of Georgia.
Right.
And a lot of people really feel, and science is beginning to prove, that the birthplace of wine was in fact Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, there are people who've been using these vessels for the last 15 years. There's a lot of interest, I think, now in historic practice, and
Right.
things are cyclical, and it's amazing that we're, returning. I think it's not amazing, but it makes sense that we're returning to historic practice and using these vessels that worked for thousands of years. Being that there are not many producers in the United States using these vessels, it's hard to troubleshoot. So for example, when I filled these this year, they all got soaking wet. Even after they were soaked up with the tartaric acid solution, when I filled them with fruit, they got wet, and they stayed wet for about 2 weeks. So it was a little unnerving, not really knowing and understanding what was going to happen. But eventually they dried out and found their equilibrium, and yeah. There are a few people in Oregon who are using Amphora that have been imported from Italy.
Okay.
We know of 3 other producers who are using the Italian imports. But they're more factory made, and they're much more generic in their nature.
Did you have a question?
Do you reuse the Amphora, or are they one use only?
Oh, that's a super great question. So the Amphora, the beautiful thing about the Amphora is that theoretically these should be good for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that's completely unlike a French oak barrel that's new only once, and after 3 fills is what we consider neutral. And my suspicion is, and what I've gleaned so far, is that these vessels become more interesting over usage, and as they become seasoned and have been filled multiple times, they've got more to offer. Being that I have access to kilns, I'm able to sterilize the Amphora if we ever have a microbial problem, Pediococcus or Brett or something that we can't get rid of in an organic vessel. We're able to sterilize and reset these. Additionally, some of these vessels that I've made are fired at a lower temperature, and they're lined with beeswax or soy wax. Some are fired at the sweet spot, and they're unlined, they're unwaxed. We can cross between unlined and lined with the access to kilns, so we could line one of them in beeswax and try it for a year and decide that that's not what we want, and we can heat it and burn the wax out, or we could take one fired at a lower temperature and line it in wax or soy, or keep them unlined, as most of them are.
Do they tend to absorb the flavor at all? Like if you did a Pinot Noir 1 year in one, would it then affect, like if you did a Riesling in the same pot the next year, or how does that work?
The vessels are very benign. So we have experimented moving from Petit Verdot to Riesling in these vessels, and we don't see any pigment that's extracted. So I think moving from one vessel to another, or from one varietal to another, is not an issue in the Amphora.
What about the process? I'm just curious to know, from beginning to end, from beginning of thinking of making an Amphora to actually getting grapes into it, how long, how many hours, how much is the labor?
For one vessel? Well, they take me in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 weeks to build. And in terms of working time, we're looking at 20 to 30 hours, depending on volume. They take a couple months to dry, between 2 and 3 months to dry before they're ready to be fired. The firing is generally in the neighborhood of 60 hours. And they've got to be transported to the winery. They get filled with a 30% tartaric acid solution that soaks up for about 48 hours. And then I let them dry, mount them on the pallets that I build, and then push them under the stemmer and fill them up. So from start to finish, if we're speeding through things, we're looking at 4 months. But most of these vessels I constructed about a year ahead of time, and I'm just now starting to build more for this coming vintage.
Any other questions? Anything that I should have asked you about the Amphora that I didn't?
I guess one of the problems with them is that they're hard to, well, they're fragile, and then the care and tending takes some real consideration. We don't want to use sulfur in these vessels. We don't want them to absorb sulfur. We can't heat them terribly hot with hot water, or they'll crack. When we're going to heat them in the kiln, we ramp up in 15 or 20 degree increments. So to clean them takes some care. They are rinsed and washed, and then I will fill them with a hefty acidic solution and drain them and let them dry. And then before they're put away, I make sure they're incredibly dry. I'll put a box fan on the top of them and get all the moisture out of the inside of the vessel, or they tend to want to grow mold. So they really take it takes some effort to keep them sustainable and viable. And then you add the fragility component to them, and they're a little harder to work with than vessels that we commonly use in the winery, but the resulting outcome is such that I'm going to push forward.
If you had to do it all over again, would you choose to use the Amphora, or do you second think it, or would you be like, of course, definitely going to use these vessels?
I would do it over again in a heartbeat. I'm so enthusiastic and excited about the wines coming from the vessels that I really think this is the direction we want to head. My intent is to produce about 1,000 cases in Amphora next year. We did 450 cases for the 14 vintage, but ultimately I could see ourselves fermenting 100% of our wines in Amphora and aging a percentage of our wines in clay, but using these vessels as our primary catalyst to make wine.
Wonderful. Any last thoughts?
I don't know if you can put this in or not, but I wanted to thank my parents
Yes,
for their
of course we can.
support.
Yeah.
My father's brilliant mind and willingness to help his crazy kid doing something that I don't know. Thank you, Dad.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Well done. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and to Stephen.